Welcome to Folds and Curves. I'm your host, Mokash Kuj. Today's guest is Michael Leasure. Michael is co-founder, president, and chief operating officer at HEARTio. HEARTio is an innovative diagnostics company focusing on creating a smarter cardiac triage process. Michael and his team at HEARTio are doing some incredible work for patients, providers, and the health system at large. I'm super excited about today's episode, and I can't wait for all of you to hear from Michael. So without further ado, let's get started.
Okay, Michael, thanks for joining us. I just want to start with a couple of facts here, a couple of pointers. Point number one, cardiac disease is the largest killer overall in America with about 650,000 deaths per year. And that's not just for medical conditions, that's for deaths overall. Point number two, it's been estimated that there's about 120 million emergency department visits per year, which when you think about it is pretty insane because that's over 1/3 of the US population. That's not on an individual basis. Some people go to the emergency room more than others, but 120 million ED visits a year is still pretty humongous. Of those 120 million, about 8 to 10% of them are due to chest pain. And that's, depending on what figures you use, that's about 7 to 12 million chest pain ED visits per year, which is, again, humongous and a huge burden on the health system. So going back to the heart conditions, there's only about 750,000 heart attacks per year, which is relatively small, about 10% of that larger 7 to 12 million figure. So, Michael, I love that you and your team are tackling this issue of correctly diagnosing ED visits. What is HEARTio? What is ECG-IO? And how are you looking to address this issue?
Yeah, so I'm Michael Leasure, co-founder of HEARTio, and we are bringing artificial intelligence paired with the electrocardiogram, which is the first test that you receive when going through that chest pain pathway that you described. So our goal is to be able to use artificial intelligence to more quickly, more accurately, and more cheaply diagnose coronary artery disease, which is the buildup of plaque within your heart vessels, which leads to acute events such as a heart attack, like you mentioned. You bring up that 7 to 12 million number. That's the number of patients with chest pain. We also like to think of it as there's chest pain and there's chest pain equivalent. Things such as shortness of breath or fatigue, where that is about 23 million patients actually who come and visit with that. So really you're analyzing patients for coronary risk on well over 20 million patients. My mom is a cardiologist. She likes to joke that you run an electrocardiogram on anybody with a pain from their kneecaps to their head. And that's only half a joke because there are well over 30 million electrocardiograms run annually in the emergency department, despite that 120 million visits that you mentioned. So our goal and our vision is to be able to provide a way for clinicians to make stronger decisions at point of presentation more confidently and without having the length of time that you usually go through for patients to get to a final diagnosis. It can take hours, even days, to get to a final diagnosis, depending on whether you're admitted for an observational period or whether you're admitted on a full-on admission basis. And even then, there's lots of tests being run that can provide unnecessary risk to the patients. Those type of tests, either invasively or non-invasively, introduce risk to patients that you don't normally want to risk. So we're trying to help alleviate all of that to the system and really reduce costs in the emergency department for insurance payers, for hospital and healthcare providers, and for patients, and to make it a better experience for all.
Great. So you mentioned the emergency department. Is that where you're initially targeting to place your ECG-IO software into, in ECGs in the emergency department?
Yeah, so that's what we envision as our initial target market. We've talked with a couple of integrated delivery networks who are hospital networks that function as both insurance payer and healthcare provider in the US healthcare system. And that's where they really see the most interest. They're reimbursed within the emergency department based on the diagnoses they get to, not necessarily the test they run. So they see a large incentive to reduce costs in the emergency department, to increase the throughput, and to have the least number of admissions possible, to be able to increase their profit margins there and passing through that cost savings to both their patients and to the insurance payers as well. So that is our initial target market. We also see a lot of value in places such as your primary care office, where you may go and get a yearly electrocardiogram. In an outpatient setting where you might be seeing a cardiologist on a yearly basis, but they don't think there's risk to run further testing yet. And even in urgent care setting, which is becoming more and more popular these days, where they don't currently treat chest pain. They send people mostly to the emergency department with an aspirin, and trying to better tailor and personalize care through those avenues as well.
Right. Okay. So that's awesome. You're also looking at outpatient facilities and even primary care. Is that what I heard?
Yep.
Great.
There's a lot of overlap between the two, but yes.
Sure. Definitely. Do you envision this as being something that potentially could be used even on the road in an ambulance on the trip to the ED?
Yep. So there's interesting thoughts about that. Yes, we think that it probably can. There's technical challenges a little bit about internet connectivity at those points. We are working on different solutions, whether it be taking a picture of an electrocardiogram, maybe with your smartphone, and sending it to the cloud that way, or even deploying our algorithm locally in the ambulance to be able to read it there. That's a solution that we envision, and that would come with a bunch of additional benefits as well. Things such as, picking up a patient and properly tailoring which health network you take them to, or which center, whether it's a level 1 center or whether it can be a local, more generalized center that you take them to for care.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're hitting on so many points that all get to the same conclusion of why this is such a valuable problem to be solving. You've talked about the cost to the health system. You've talked about the consequences of unnecessary tests, not to mention unnecessary treatments if the patient is misdiagnosed. Could you talk a little bit about what are some of the consequences of a misdiagnosis? Are patients misdiagnosed with having cardiac disease when they don't? And on the flip side, are patients who have cardiac disease not diagnosed as having that in the ED?
Yep. So we see, and there's literature out there on this, that it ends up being 55 to 80% of patients who walk into the emergency department in that chest pain pathway end up overtreated and over-tested for the amount of coronary disease they actually have. So if you think about the cost of the system, that all builds up. The average cost of admissions, $2,400 a night in the emergency department or so, and the chest pain admission time is about 2.5 days on average. So there's that piece, but there's also the piece where you can see in literature, somewhere between 2 and 6% of people are misdiagnosed and sent home and have disease and end up to go have heart attacks. And those are the patients who usually end up in a litigation pathway, which is a messy situation for all.
Yeah.
So we can really, I say personalized care, and that's kind of a buzzword, but we can better allow for clinicians at presentation to tailor care. A clinician, particularly in the emergency department, has so many patients that additional data points up front when you walk in is something that is extremely intrinsically valuable. I think that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely. So question about, why now? Is there some sort of technological advancement that ECG-IO is built on that allowed this to occur now versus maybe 20 years ago or 30 years ago? Why is this such a good idea now and such a good project to be pursuing now?
Yep. So really it comes down to the widespread availability of computing power and the ease of use with the cloud. Right now we're paired with Oracle for our cloud provider services, and they make it so easy to be able to build your own API infrastructure, send things to and from the cloud at will. And with the way GPUs are being developed now, we mostly train and test on NVIDIA GPUs. It's really, the power is there to run X number of experiments simultaneously and allow for better training and testing of your machine learning algorithms. Whereas, say, 20 years ago, this wasn't something that was possible. If you were trying to send something to some other computer somewhere on dial-up, that is one, unreliable, two, could take hours. So it's really a factor of computing power and the knowledge in terms of electrocardiography interpretation it's been about the same over the last 40 to 60 years. I mean, there's been some minor advances in the way people are reading things, and particularly with the devices people are reading from. You see your cardiomobile device, your AliveCor device, which is one of the little pads you put your two fingers on and get an electrocardiogram that way.
Yeah.
Data is more available now than it ever has been before. There's so many different ways to get electrocardiograms, and people are using them for screening tools. So it's really a combination of things of computing power, availability of devices, and those are really the two primary driving forces that I see for why this is happening now.
Yeah, that all makes sense. And I think you brought up, that ECG technology hasn't much changed over several decades. And I heard from and read actually that many ECGs do give some sort of suggestion of what's going on, and I don't know what the technology is behind that, but my understanding is that like half of them are rejected by who's ever reading it. So there's the technology saying, here's what we think the diagnosis is, and then there's someone reading it who's either confirming or rejecting that. And my understanding is so many of those are rejected to the point of, well, what's the point of even doing it if we can't trust it and are just going to end up reading it on our own? Is that true? And what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where you're looking at the electrocardiogram. If I go and talk to a cardiologist, yeah, they'll say about 50% or so. It's a toss-up whether they accept or decline the reading. The readings they're good. They provide information on, say, whether a patient's having an arrhythmia, whether they're in atrial fibrillation, whether they're having some sort of dangerous tachycardia. And it's good for that regards. It's also good to determine if someone really is having a heart attack, or if they've had a prior heart attack, and where it's located even. Now, if you go into, say, a primary care physician office where maybe they're taking an electrocardiogram, I'm guessing they're probably not overreading and changing the interpretation quite as often, and it's used more there. Interpretation algorithms today are built on, and you can actually go and look in the user guides for them, about 76 parameters that are looking at things such as, is there the presence of a QRS notch, which is the wave as it goes up at the top? Is there a notch at the top? Is there the presence of, say, a U wave? And it's looking at all of these really morphological features in the electrocardiogram as generalized over really a global population. So it's not that the algorithms are necessarily bad. The algorithms are very good, but they're just not specialized on a per use case basis. And that's kind of, we think, what makes our algorithm different, is that by allowing the machine to look further beyond than what just an individual morphological wave is doing, and looking at the interrelativity between all the 12 leads, which are the 12 different electrodes and channels that you place on your body, that we're able to make more in-depth inferences that really carry more strongly across the general population and are more objective.
Okay, so yeah, help me understand that, because I don't understand the inter. What was the word again? The
interrelativity, I guess, would be the right word.
Okay, so the interrelativity between the 12 leads. So is it, my understanding is that at the 12, each of the 12 leads is taking measurements of different waves. Is that correct?
Kind of, yes. So if you think about how your heart works, your heart is really, at its core, a pump. It's a pump that generates an electromagnetic field in a three-dimensional space. So if you think about how an electrocardiogram works, is you get 12 electrodes put on your body to measure different points in the same contraction of the pump. So when you read an electrocardiogram, normally you're looking at a kind of a two-dimensional representation on a piece of paper. Here's what this electrocardiogram looks like. And you're looking at, say, lead 1, lead AVR, wherever lead you're looking at, and looking at them each independently to see if there are changes there that would be indicative of, say, some sort of arrhythmia, whether you're whether you're considering the patient might be at risk or maybe experience ischemia or some sort of ischemic changes, or comparing it to a baseline. What we're doing is we're looking at all 12 leads at the same time and allowing the machine to say correlate a slight change in lead 1 versus a slight change in lead 3 versus a slight change in, say, lead AVL that might correlate to something even further than what you can see with your eye today. So we're able to look at all the leads with a better resolution than you can see with the human eye.
No, that makes total sense. And I think that gives more clarity to why a lot of computing power might be needed, right? If you're talking about 12 leads and all the interactions between each lead, I mean, the amount of computing power must go up by a factor of many times more than 12, right?
Yes, yeah. So we train, I think usually, we train right now, I believe, and test on one Tesla GPU. One NVIDIA Tesla GPU, which is their highest end GPU. And we've kind of optimized our algorithm to be relatively computing power friendly. We can try to run many experiments at once. In prior versions of the algorithm, we were training on up to 8 GPUs simultaneously, just to give you an idea of what's out there.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
that would be, if you were to go and go and buy a $5,000 computer, this would probably be one of the GPUs maybe in there. Each of them run about $2,000 to $3,000 each.
Gotcha. Okay. So how fast, given all that computing power, how fast, at this stage, or what maybe even what you're looking to get to, perhaps, how fast can you read an EKG or ECG?
So it really, the length of time is dependent on how long it takes to transfer it. Right now we have a submission portal that you can go in or send an email to for demo purposes, really. And it'll take it and read it in our server and produce a result within 3 to 5 seconds. Now getting it back through an email might take 10 to 20 seconds, but we're working on making that faster. But it's really almost an instantaneous type reading.
Okay, so you're telling me that the time it takes to email the result is longer than the time it takes to compute it.
Correct.
Okay, yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what to make of that, because I think of email as pretty instantaneous. I mean, yeah, there's a slight delay, but it's pretty darn quick. Okay, so, and then, you mentioned some of the big major advances here are the time, which I think you just discussed. What about the cost? I mean, what kind of, well, and the cost is going to tie into another question I have, which is like, who is the customer? Is the customer the ECG manufacturer who's going to implement this in their machine? Is it the hospital health system who's going to use it as like some sort of a plug-in to an ECG? Who's paying for this product?
Yep. So I guess I'll start off with addressing the costs. So the cost of the device is not that high. We've received a breakthrough device designation from the FDA, which allows for 4 years after approval for us to have Medicare reimbursement for our product. So actually for the healthcare system, it shouldn't cost any money. They should be able to get the full price reimbursed, depending on whether or not we're charging what is determined by Medicare to be a reasonable price. So we're thinking in the range of tens of dollars. If you go look at other tests that are out there, there's a number of other tests that are used to kind of analyze the presence of coronary artery disease, things such as a coronary CT, a CT angiogram, a nuclear study, whether it's your SPECT or your PET scans, you might have heard of those. Even down to your innovation tests, such as a coronary angiogram, which range from anywhere in the mid to high hundreds to thousands of dollars to the healthcare system, assuming they get full reimbursement for them.
So are you, sorry to interrupt, but is this also cutting those out? Like there is a cost to ECGIO, but do you also think that there will be cost savings greater than that cost in terms of avoiding those tests that you just mentioned?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily want to replace the downstream testing. What we want to do is we want to allow the clinician at point of presentation to make a more informed decision about what testing might be necessary. Whether it's a stress echo, whether it's a nuclear study, whether it's a CT, and instead of taking anywhere between 2 to 5 tests, after using ECGIO, you can now maybe pick which test is most appropriate for your patient based on risk levels. It's really, it's a better risk stratification tool at point of presentation.
Gotcha. So it could potentially like narrow that differential diagnosis.
Yep. So that's what we're trying to do. So instead of taking days, maybe weeks before you can actually get your final overall diagnosis, if you're sent outside of the emergency department, sometimes it takes days to weeks. You can get it really streamlined to maybe after ECGIO. It only takes another day or two, depending on which test you're going to, or if you're going to another test at all.
Gotcha.
So in terms of who the customer is, the hospital network will have to be the ones to choose to adopt ECGIO, and then their physicians will be able to use it. We're envisioning it in such a way where in your EMR, you go down and you order your tests today, whether you're ordering a blood draw troponin assay, or even an exercise EKG. You would just go down, you would choose ECGIO from your drop down, and it would produce a result instantaneously as opposed to having to send out for further results. So they would be your customer. In terms of your payer, it would go back to insurance. So just like today with any other tests, your insurance, your healthcare provider would bill the insurance provider for what the cost of the test is. And Medicare, as I said, does reimburse for this product for 4 years after approval.
Yeah. Is there any other advantages to that, FDA breakthrough designation? I'm sure it accelerates development a little bit. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah, so it provides a few things. It allows for the FDA and the organization who is a breakthrough device to work together more collaboratively. It's the FDA's commitment to trying to bring devices that are novel and can provide a lot of value to patients to market more quickly. So work back and forth with the FDA more collaboratively in, say, sprint type discussions. If you're familiar with the agile methodology, where you sit down and you talk through things for a few weeks iteratively to hammer things out. It also allows for expedited review. It combined with their, I think it was the expedited access pathway a few years ago, where if we are to submit a submission to the FDA, we get really a preferential review for our product as opposed to other devices.
So so approximately how long does it normally take if you didn't have breakthrough designation? Just the review process
The
after you
actual
submit.
review process, from what we've seen in doing an analysis, is in the realm of 4 to 6 months for a device such as this. If you go in for drug devices, if you go for drugs or pharmaceuticals, that can take years to do review, depending on your data and how many studies you've had to do. So it's not necessarily overly long, and we've seen it a little less for breakthrough devices. What the exact number is, I'm not 100% sure, because the breakthrough pathway is relatively new. There have not been very many approvals through the breakthrough pathway yet.
Yeah, so the fact that there's not many, I think, is kind of a peek into what I think why this is interesting for your company, because the breakthrough designation, from my point of view, isn't just like an incentive. We want this because it's faster and we'll get expedited review. But I think it's also a milestone, right? Because to get breakthrough designation, you need to have certain characteristics to qualify the product. And maybe if you could talk about those a little bit. I mean, those are all characteristics that are not easy to get. It means that you have, it basically means you have a product that the FDA wants to see patients get, so long as it meets the requirements for safety and efficacy.
Yeah, exactly. So the way the FDA defines what can be considered a breakthrough device is it's 2 criteria. You have to meet the first one and then any of the 4 second criteria. The first criteria is that the device provides for more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating human diseases or conditions. And then for the second criteria, again, meeting just one of these 4, at least one of the 4, A, it represents breakthrough technology. B, no approved or cleared alternatives exist. C, it offers significant advantages over existing approved or cleared alternatives. Or D, the device availability is in the best interest of patients. So there's a fair amount of subjectivity there. We personally believe we fit all 4 of those second 4, but those are the criteria for our breakthrough device.
Right. Yeah. And I think the FDA, I think, often leaves things a little bit open to interpretation because it also gives them a certain degree of flexibility. If they have like hardwired rules as to what they can and can't approve, it kind of leaves them with little flexibility to make a smart decision. Um,
It's
so
one of
yeah.
those
Yeah.
like
Sorry. Go
how
ahead.
it's one of those things like it's hard to put together a set of rules that applies to say our device, our software device versus say an implantable pacemaker. How
Yeah.
do you compare? It's like an apples to oranges comparison. So it makes sense that there is such subjectivity and things are on a case by case basis.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get that designation, I mean, I have to imagine there's a certain degree of evidence or proof that you had to show them to say we're deserving of this. Do is that true? And what, if so, what did you have to show them? What is your evidence of your efficacy and safety here?
Yep. So we put together an application, and part of that application was reporting on the results of one of our validation studies that we completed, where we took all patients who had a digitized electrocardiogram and a correlate coronary angiogram in over 7 years at the largest clinical cardiology private practice in America, where we were trying to see how well we could predict the presence and severity of coronary artery disease. We trained on about 85% of that and then tested on, validated on the remaining 15%.
Hmm.
And our results were sensitivity, which is the power to rule in disease in patients that have disease, was about 93%. And specificity, which is the power to rule out disease in patients who don't have disease, was about 96 to 97%. So we
Okay.
include that as part of our application.
Yeah. So for the non like data analytics audience out there, explain, why 85%, or maybe not even why, but what it means to train and what it means to validate. And so it kind of explained why that's significant.
Yep. So the training of an algorithm is where you go and you feed your architecture the input, in this case the electrocardiogram, and the output, in this case the results from the coronary angiogram, to allow it to learn statistical correlations between the two, so it can better make decisions in the future. Sometimes you take higher training proportions if you're looking at an entirely new subset population of patients that you've never seen before. In our case, patients with an ECG on a specific set of machines. And then the validation is really where you go and you run the algorithm through the patient cohort, the remaining of the patient cohort, to figure out what the performance statistics are.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, a training is really like a practice, and a validation is like, I get to the game.
Right, right. So that 15%, I mean, they're mutually exclusive, right? There's no overlap. That 15%, the algorithm's never seen before, and you're testing to see if it works.
Correct.
Um, Great. So that gets you to the point of breakthrough designation.
Mhm.
Now, I assume maybe there was some sort of a meeting with the FDA, and now they're requesting probably what is the next level of evidence to get this thing through to patients.
Yep.
And what is that? To whatever level you can speak to, what are the next steps?
Yeah, so the next steps are with any FDA application, we now have to go through a pivotal study. The
Mhm.
pivotal study is the study in which you put together your hypothesis to compare against some comparative device or some other benchmark for whatever indication you want your device to be used in commercial release. So in our case, it would be comparing our device against an early stage test, such as an exercise electrocardiogram, for determining the presence of coronary artery disease. So we're still trying to hammer out exactly what that pivotal study looks like. We
Mhm.
don't think it's going to be too high of a hurdle to clear. We're thinking on the scale of hundreds of patients prospectively,
Mhm.
with a number of sites, which we're in discussions now to finalize what that looks like, and getting our pivotal protocol to the FDA to figure out, hey, is this in line with what you guys are expecting?
Okay, okay.
So, not getting into overly specifics, but are the types of patients you're looking at going to be patients who are at risk for coronary artery disease, or are these going to be healthy patients and you're testing against a healthy heart rhythm? What do the patients look like?
Yeah, so that's one of the interesting questions that we are answering. We're envisioning testing on a patient population that has gone to the coronary catheterization lab, the invasive procedure, again, which looks for coronary artery disease in your vessels.
Mhm.
So we're envisioning that being the point of selection for patients. So all patients will have gone to the coronary catheterization lab. So the patients will have been under suspicion of coronary artery disease already. The nice thing is that the population that makes it to the coronary catheterization lab is quoted on being about 40% actually having no coronary artery disease,
Mm.
defined, I believe, by the greatest blockage within your heart's vessels, less than 20% blockage across all four of your primary vessels.
Right.
So there is a natural population of quote unquote healthy patients built into that coronary catheterization population.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because that almost gives you like a third category of people who are at the lab, but they're not necessarily having disease, as defined by that 20%
Yeah,
benchmark.
exactly. And if you go back to what we view as our value proposition is trying to bring that 40% down as much as possible, getting these patients who are going to these invasive procedures, not going to these invasive procedures. I think that everybody agrees that that would be a win. There's a lot of
Yeah.
bad things that can happen when you're invading patients unnecessarily.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, exactly. It's invasive, complications could happen, and it's super expensive. I mean, these are giant machines that are, these are private labs that require expert care and lots of time. And there's just, I mean, you're hitting on all the right points. I kind of want to pivot a little bit towards like further in the future. So I think that's very reasonable for your short-term studies, or this is probably you're probably looking at with these studies like a 2 to 3 year time horizon, maybe 1 to 2 years. What are you thinking there?
Well, it's a good question again. Probably somewhere in the 1 to 3 year range. It depends
Hmm.
on how quickly we can launch the study and then how long the FDA review process takes. It also depends on what's available for us to launch in overseas. We're working on another short-term study that we're looking at. It's probably going to be on the scale of 20 to 30,000 patients, looking at patient records in the past as opposed to doing it retrospectively as opposed to doing it prospectively on patients who are walking in today. And we think that with that study, we may be able to launch outside the US in places such as the EU, now the UK, maybe Canada, and other places around the world. So just looking at that as well. So our timing really depends on what you're looking, what your definition of timing is. There's lots of things in play for us.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. That's great. So it's really looking at a global launch almost. Well, not almost, it is. So beyond that horizon, one of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking about, AI for ECGs is this sort of technology applicable to other types of wave diagnostics, things like EEGs for seizures or EMGs for sort of neuromuscular complications. Um, is it? Do you think that this type of technology is applicable there, or are they really like completely different things going on?
We definitely think the technology is applicable. We haven't really started investigating it. The
Mhm.
EEG is one in particular that's of interest to us. And there's another company here in Pittsburgh called Forest Devices, which has their own physical device for taking an EEG to determine if a patient's having a stroke, and they're trying to put that in ambulances.
Okay.
So there is precedence for working in that space. That being said, there are other cardiovascular diagnostics that we're looking at as well. Things is not predicting disease, predicting, say, your ejection fraction, which is essentially a measure of what proportion of your blood your heart is taking in versus pumping out, a measure of systolic function. Things such as the risk for cardiac events, we can predict whether you're going to have a heart attack or a stroke or experience syncope in the next year, or even trying to predict whether a patient's going to undergo complications if they were to go to a catheterization or be hospitalized. So there are other avenues within the cardiovascular realm that we want to explore before trying to jump into other areas as well. The idea would be to try to provide, again, as much information upfront to a clinician when they're making a decision so that they can make the most informed decision for their patients. Right
Yeah.
now,
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. Forming your sort of expertise in the cardiac therapeutic area before looking at branching out makes complete sense from a strategic perspective. And yeah, I think the value in predicting a lot of those things you mentioned is again huge. I was listening to a lecture the other day, and it was basically saying sudden cardiac events, not just heart attacks, but cardiac arrest. That it's kind of a misnomer because a lot of these patients have warning signs weeks in advance, and they're kind of subtle, not enough to go to the doctor for, but certainly, I don't know about certainly, but potentially something that could be predicted or warned ahead of time to get them potential treatment, life-saving treatment.
exactly. It's one of those things that if we, can put ECGIO at your yearly PCP visit, a lot of that can be avoided with lifestyle changes or therapeutic changes. Whether we put you on some form of medicine, stuff like that, to help make patients' quality of life much better.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you think of, so PCP visit is sort of closest to the patient, but even one step closer would be, I think, the Apple Watch. Do you see something like this going in the Apple Watches? And if so, I'm curious, are you familiar with what technology is in the Apple Watch? I mean, I think it's an ECG, right?
Yep. So they have an ECG in the newest Apple Watch, your Series 4, your Series 5. Your newest Samsung watches have it. I believe your newest Fitbit watches have it. Your newest Garmin watches might even have it, where they're using a sensor and a ground to try to predict around your wrist what a lead one of your electrocardiogram would be. That's what it's most similar to. If you go
Okay.
and take an Apple Watch report today, it'll say, hey, this is most similar to what you would get from lead one, which is a limb lead from your electrocardiogram.
Mm-hmm.
So we do think it's plausible. We've done some early stage research, and we do think that it is plausible using just one lead of a device, like your Apple Watch and such, to predict coronary artery disease. We think that's feasible. What we think is more feasible and probably more easily to feel comfortable with in the general world is putting it on things such as your Holter monitors, which is the continuous monitoring thing your physician will send you home with for 24 to 48 hours, or your at-home things such as there's iRhythm has a Zio patch where you have little EKG leads, so you just sit on your body all day.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably more feasible, particularly since it's hard to control the output from a device that isn't yours. So if we could partner up with a manufacturer of a cardiovascular specific device,
Mm-hmm.
that might make more sense. But we do think it's very feasible.
Right. So it would be more feasible to do it in a like a medical device than a consumer device that has some medical apps on it, basically.
Well, it's not that it's not feasible. There is an ethical component as well. You have a device that's say 90% accurate, and you have someone who's sitting at home taking their electrocardiogram 5 to 10 times a day. Well, once a week, you're going to end up with, say, at least one false positive, and then you may send more patients to
Mm-hmm.
the emergency department than really needed. There's that dilemma as well.
Right. Yeah, the error rate is going to be more it's going to be more of a problem the more you use it, or alternatively, the more disease states that one device can be used for. With a lot of these like multiple disease diagnostic devices, they run into that problem as well, right? Where one device is supposed to diagnose 20 different diseases, you have an error rate for each of one of those, and that can become problematic too, right?
Yeah, that can become problematic too. We see pretty strong performance in our initial evaluations across all of our different predictions. That doesn't mean that we're sure that each one will hold up in a general population, but we have to figure that out. That's what studies are for.
Yeah, definitely.
We definitely feel better about putting this in a device where the input can be controlled, and isn't necessarily reliant on a large range of user variation, things such as your consumer products. So putting it in, say, something that might be applied by a clinician, we feel a bit better about that.
That's great. One last thing I kind of wanted to talk to you about was not just the product and, the problem you're trying to solve, but I think your team's kind of interesting too. You're recent graduates and you started this company several years ago, HEARTio. What is it like being a recent graduate starting a company? It's not abnormal, but it's certainly not what everyone's doing when they graduate school. I think there's probably a set of unique challenges that young founders face, and I'd be curious to hear your experience and your advice for other young founders.
Yeah, I mean, my experience has been pretty positive, but it's because I have a family that's willing to help support me and a good support foundation. So it's myself and then Utgers and Adam who both started working on this during their PhD candidacies and now work full time for HEARTio.
Mhm.
And really, the challenges are things such as lack of experience, the perceived challenges. So when we go and speak with people, they come back to us with feedback as such as, where's your gray hair on your team, or it's tough for first-time founders to take a product to market. You guys don't have any commercialization experience, which is all, it's all fair criticism. And the challenge I have to that is that it's the same of anybody doing anything. You can surround yourself with smart people who can help you make more informed decisions. And we've gone and done that. We put together an advisory board of strong advisors in business and medical device and even artificial intelligence space, and an extremely strong clinical advisory board of clinicians across the board in cardiology who help us make decisions that I would say are on par with. You could put anybody in this situation and we can make decisions as well as, if not better than them. In terms of the specializedness of the space, I think that we actually have an advantage, not being people who come from specifically cardiovascular backgrounds. My co-founder, Utgers, has PhDs in computational electrophysiology, so he does leak into the cardiovascular background, but we're not thinking about things in ways that clinicians are looking at them today. We're not telling our algorithm to look at here, let's go look at the QRS duration or the RR interval or the ST segment to make your decisions. We're looking at it in a more objective and really more robust fashion than we think someone in electrophysiology would tackle the problem.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that the heart of most innovations, right? Willing to look at something in a completely novel and new way, and willing to ask those hard questions and willing to take a leap of faith to try to answer them. I think absolutely being young can have that, where you're willing to just ask, like, what if we try this? So yeah, definitely, absolutely, man. So do you feel like having that clinical advisory board, those really like senior clinicians, as well as your real strong expertise in machine learning, with world-renowned professors, I think from Carnegie Mellon, do you find that helps push back against some of that criticism for
It
being
does.
young?
It does. At the end of the day, people are going to have their opinions, and you can't always change them. The best you can do is go out there and put your best foot forward. And if people don't see eye to eye with you, then that's how it goes. We're able to rely on all of our advisors to really help us put together something that we think is going to provide value to the world. That's really the end goal at the end of the day is, hey, we have this product that we think can do a lot of good for a lot of people, and we need to do what it takes to get it there. And we think that that's really the function of our advisory, not necessarily to help avoid the pushback. The pushback is really unavoidable. It's going to happen. But to make sure that we're building a product in a way that makes sense and in a way that can help save lives.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to hear. So you mentioned that your mom is a cardiologist, correct? Does that help you at all? Look at this space with, you might not be a clinician, but you certainly have a clinician in your ear over, however many years you've spent with her. So how has that impacted your ability to help lead this company?
Oh, it's great. I talk to her every day, and I'm always bouncing things off her. I'll send her a text in the middle of the day. Oh, what does the impact of an equivocal nuclear study mean for pre-test probability of patients having disease walking into the cath lab? Just ask her a question like that.
Yeah.
response within an hour. Right? I get one response. Generally you want more than one response, but it gives me at least a point to start conversation with someone and figure out exactly what the right questions to ask are while still sounding relatively intelligent to the general population.
Yeah, no, you're right. I have doctors in the family too, and I think particularly, I mean, maybe in other places too, but in my experience, science and medicine, um, just being able to hear from someone is infinitely more, at least efficient. Maybe not more valuable. It's more efficient than trying to search something through PubMed. And you're right. It's not just searching; it's knowing what to search. Um, and usually the answer you'll get will be like a sentence, like it'll be so obvious to them, but it'll be, it'll take you days to get to that same point, if not longer. So yeah, absolutely, man. I definitely empathize with that. I've had the same experiences. Thanks for coming on the show, man. I think that's all we got. I'll stop recording.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Michael. I know I enjoyed talking to him. To find out more about HEARTio or Michael, please check out the show notes. Thanks so much again.